They said no decent man would ever buy a woman. But what if I told you he wasn't buying a woman? What if he was accepting a mission he didn't even know he was on? Out where the Wyoming wind howls louder than a man's conscience, there lived a rancher named Silas Boone. He was a man carved from granite and grief, his face a roadmap of hard winters and silent sorrows. His ranch was a testament to a life put on hold. The barn door hung on a single rusted hinge. The stove rattled like a dying man's last breath. And the porch swing, the one his wife Maureen used to love, hadn't moved in 5 long years. Not since the day he buried her. Silas didn't drink. He didn't laugh. He didn't ask God for a single thing, because he figured God had stopped listening a long time ago. Until the night he won a poker hand he never meant to play. He'd gone into Cheyenne for supplies, just flour and salt. But a storm blew in, a black-hearted monster that turned the roads to mud soup. He was stuck. The only light in town came from the saloon, a place Silas hadn't set foot in since Marin passed. But it was that, or freeze. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and cheap whiskey. A game was running hot in the corner, presided over by a greasy land speculator named Jedediah Thorne. Silas just wanted a quiet corner, but Jedediah, loud and boastful, dragged him in. "One hand, rancher, for old time's sake." Silas didn't want to play. He had no luck left to spend. But refusing a man like Jedediah in a room full of his cronies was a good way to find trouble. So he sat. He played the hand he was dealt. He didn't bluff, didn't scheme. He just laid his cards down. A full house, aces over kings. The room went quiet. Jedediah's face turned the color of spoiled meat. He'd bet everything. His land deeds, his horse, his last gold piece. And one more thing. The pot wasn't just money. It was a girl. She was standing in the shadows by the door. No more than 17. Her belly was swollen with child beneath a threadbare shawl. Her eyes were ancient, filled with a weariness that didn't belong on a face so young. Her name, Jedediah spat, was Clara, and she wasn't there by choice. Her own mother, he crowed, had handed her over to settle a gambling debt. "She's used to chores," Jedediah sneered, as if that made the whole thing right. The men at the table laughed, a low, ugly sound. But Silas didn't laugh. He looked at the girl, then at the pile of deeds, and then back at the girl. He saw the faint tremor in her hands. He saw the way she stared at a spot on the floor, making herself as small as possible. He saw a soul that had been abandoned, and that was a language Silas understood all too well. He gathered the winnings, he signed the deed transfers, then he stood up, walked over to the girl, and said 2 words. "Come on." He walked her out of that saloon without another word, the laughter of the men fading behind them. As they stepped into the cold night air, Jedediah Thorne stumbled out after them, his face twisted with rage. "You don't know what you've done, Boone," he hissed, his voice slurring. "She ain't just some girl. She's marked. You'll regret this." Silas didn't stop walking. He just settled her into his wagon, pulled a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders, and started the long, quiet ride home. Marked? What could that even mean? He didn't know it yet, but he hadn't just won a poker game. He just stepped into the middle of a war, and from that moment on, nothing about his quiet, broken life would ever be the same. The ride back to the ranch was silent. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the low moan of the wind. Clara didn't speak. She didn't even look at him. She just sat huddled under the blanket, a small, fragile ghost in the dark. Silas didn't press her. He knew what it was to have your world ripped out from under you. Words were useless things in the face of that kind of pain. When they finally arrived, he led her inside. The cabin was cold, the fire long dead. He saw her shiver, her arms wrapped tight around her belly. He didn't say anything. He just went to the hearth, struck a match, and coaxed a flame to life. He made her a simple stew, leaving it on the table for her, then prepared the small spare room, the room that had once been Marin's sewing room. He laid out fresh blankets and a clean nightgown. "You can rest here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "No one will bother you." She finally looked at him then. Her eyes were wide and searching, like a spooked deer trying to figure out if he was the hunter or just another shadow in the woods. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, then disappeared into the room. closing the door softly behind her. That night, Silas sat in his chair by the dying fire, unable to sleep. Jedediah's words echoed in his head. She's marked. It sounded like a threat, like a curse. He thought about the shawl she wore. It was old and frayed, but the pattern was strange. A repeating design of a thorny vine wrapping around a single stylized bird. He'd never seen anything like it. Was that the mark Jedediah meant? The next few days passed in a haze of unspoken rules and quiet routines. Clara rose before the sun, sweeping the porch, boiling water, moving through the house like a whisper. She never asked for anything. She ate what was given to her in small, precise bites, as if she were trying to take up as little space as possible. She was a person who had been taught to earn every breath. Silas watched her. He noticed the way she flinched whenever he entered a room too quickly. He saw how she would stare out the window towards a distant road, her expression taut with fear. She wasn't just running from a bad debt. She was running from something much, much worse. One afternoon he came in from the barn and found her standing by that same window, her hand pressed against the glass. She was pale, her breathing shallow. "What is it?" he asked, his voice gentle. She jumped, startled, a small gasp escaping her lips. "Nothing," she whispered, turning away. "Just a rider, far off." Silas looked. He saw a lone horseman on the ridge, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. The rider sat there for a long moment, just watching the ranch before turning his horse and disappearing over the rise. It could have been anyone, a lost traveler, another rancher, but the look on Clara's face told him it wasn't. That night a storm broke. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder cracked the sky open. Silas was checking the locks when he heard a sound from Clara's room. A muffled cry. He hesitated, then knocked softly on her door. "Clara, are you all right?" Silence, then a broken sob. He slowly opened the door. She was sitting up in bed, her face buried in her hands, her whole body shaking. "He's coming," she wept. "I know he's coming for me." "Who's coming?" Silas asked, taking a step into the room. She looked up, her eyes wild with terror. "The man who owns me," she whispered. "Not Jedediah. The real one. The one who put his mark on me." She pointed a trembling finger at the shawl, which was draped over a chair. "The thorny vine. It's his family crest. The Kemps." Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The Kemps. He knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew that name. Walter Kemp was the wealthiest, most powerful man for 100 miles. He owned the bank, the general store, half the politicians, and all of the fear. He had a son, Elias, a cruel, arrogant young man known for his temper and his vices. "Walter Kemp?" Silas asked, his voice low. Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she choked out. "His son, Elias. He's the father of my baby." And just like that, the entire story changed. This wasn't about a gambling debt. This was about the son of the most dangerous man in Wyoming. Elias Kemp wasn't the kind of man who let things go, and he certainly wasn't the kind of man who would let someone he considered his property just walk away. Silas looked from her terrified face to the storm raging outside, the rider on the ridge, the whispered threat from Jedediah. It was all starting to connect. He hadn't saved her. He had just painted a target on his own back. Silas spent the rest of that night with his old rifle across his lap, sitting in the dark, watching the windows. Every gust of wind, every rattling pane of glass sounded like hoofbeats. He was no fool. Taking in a girl was one thing. Standing against the Kemp family was something else entirely. It was a death sentence. But when he looked at the closed door to Clara's room, he thought of Marin. She would have done the same. She never backed down from a fight, especially when it was for someone who couldn't fight for themselves. "Some things are worth dying for, Silas," she used to say, "and a person's soul is at the top of that list." He had to know more. He had to understand what he was up against. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. Clara was quiet at breakfast, her eyes puffy and red. He waited until she was finished, then he spoke, keeping his voice even. "You need to tell me everything, Clara. If I'm going to protect you, I need to know what I'm fighting." She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. Then the story came tumbling out. A quiet, horrifying torrent of words. She wasn't from Cheyenne. Her family had a small farmstead a day's ride east. Elias Kemp had seen her in town one day and had taken an interest. It wasn't courtship. It was a campaign of intimidation. He'd pressured her father, threatening to call in loans to ruin them. He'd cornered her, whispered vile promises and threats. Her parents, terrified of the Kemps, had pushed her to accept his advances, hoping it would save their farm. But it wasn't a romance. It was an assault. A brutal, repeated violation that left her feeling like a ghost in her own skin. When she discovered she was pregnant, she thought naively that he might show some shred of decency. Instead, he'd laughed. A Kemp doesn't dirty his name with farm girl baggage, he'd told her. He'd given her two options: get rid of it or disappear. But her mother, this is where the story took a strange turn. Her mother, who had seemed so cowed and fearful, had done something unexpected. One night she woke Clara up, pressing a small, heavy satchel into her hands. "You have to run," she'd whispered, her face grim. "This is a debt I can't pay for you." Then she'd given Clara the shawl with the thorny vine. "Don't ever take this off," she'd commanded. "It will keep you safe." The next day, her mother told Elias she had sold Clara to Jedediah Thorne to pay off a fabricated debt. It was a lie, a desperate gambit to get Clara away from him, to send her west where Elias might not follow. But something about it didn't add up. Why give her a shawl with the crest of the very family she was running from? "It will keep you safe." How? It was like wearing a sign that said, "I belong to the Kemps." And then Silas remembered something else. In the saloon, when he'd won the hand, Jedediah hadn't just been angry. He'd been scared. He'd looked at Silas with a kind of panicked disbelief, as if Silas wasn't supposed to be the one to win. The whole thing felt staged. But if the poker game was a setup, what was the real play? Silas looked at the shawl again, draped over the back of the chair. He walked over and picked it up. The wool was coarse, but the embroidery was fine, detailed work. He ran his fingers over the thorny vine, the little bird trapped within its coils. There was something odd about it, a small lump sewn into the hem, right beneath the bird. His fingers fumbled with the thick thread. He pulled his pocket knife and carefully, painstakingly, snipped the stitches. The fabric parted. Something small and cold fell into his palm. It wasn't a coin. It wasn't a stone. It was a key, small, iron, and intricately shaped. On its head was a single stamped letter, MM for Moran. His breath caught in his chest. A tidal wave of confusion and memory washed over him. It couldn't be. Moran had been dead for 5 years. What in God's name did his wife have to do with this terrified pregnant girl? He turned the key over and over in his hand, his mind racing. Maureen had secrets, he knew that. She was a member of church groups, ladies' aid societies. She was always helping people. But this felt different, deeper, more dangerous. He looked at Clara, who was watching him with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "What is this?" she whispered. "I don't know," Silas said, his voice a hoarse rasp. But he was lying. He had a terrible sinking feeling that he did know, or at least, he knew where to start looking. He strode over to the old dust-covered chest in the corner of the room. It was Marin's hope chest. He hadn't opened it since the day she died. His hands trembled as he lifted the heavy lid. The scent of dried lavender and old memories filled the air. Inside were her wedding dress, a lock of her hair, dried flowers, and beneath it all, a small leather-bound journal. He'd never read it. He felt it was a violation of her privacy. But now he had to. He opened it. Her familiar, elegant script filled the pages. He flipped through entries about the ranch, the weather, her hopes for a family they never had, and then he found it. The entries from the last year of her life. They weren't about baking or sewing. They were about a network, a secret underground railroad of women, run by wives and widows and church ladies, designed to help other women escape desperate situations. Abusive husbands, cruel fathers, men like Elias Kemp. Marin wasn't just a member, she was a leader. She'd used the ranch as a way station, a safe house for women on their way to a new life somewhere far away. The journal was filled with coded names and locations, and then he saw a name that made his blood run cold. Clara's mother. She was one of Marin's contacts. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Clara's mother hadn't sold her daughter. She had sent her. She had sent her to the one safe place she knew, Silas Boone's ranch. The poker game was a smokescreen, a way to transfer Clara from one point in the network to another without raising suspicion. Jedediah was likely part of it, a reluctant actor paid to play a role. He was supposed to lose to another operative, someone who would have spirited Clara away in the night. But Silas had stumbled into the middle of it, an outsider, an unknown variable. That's why Jedediah had been so terrified. The plan had gone wrong, and the key was for something here, on the ranch, a safe place Marin had built. He looked up from the journal, his eyes meeting Clara's. "Your mother?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She didn't abandon you. She saved you. She sent you to me." Before Clara could even process this earth-shattering revelation, a loud, sharp rap echoed from the front door. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was the hard, impatient sound of someone who didn't expect to be kept waiting. Silas's hand went to the rifle he'd left by the hearth. He looked at Clara, his expression grim. "Go to your room, lock the door, and do not make a sound." She scrambled to her feet, her face ashen, and fled. Silas took a deep breath, walked to the door, and pulled it open. On his porch stood two men. The first was the town's sheriff, a fat, wheezing man named Cobb who was known to be in Walter Kemp's pocket. The second man, standing slightly behind him, made Silas's heart stop. It was Elias Kemp. He was younger than Silas had pictured, with a handsome, cruel face and pale, empty eyes. He was dressed in expensive clothes that were completely out of place on a dusty ranch porch. A silver-handled pistol was strapped to his hip. "Boone," Sheriff Cobb wheezed, avoiding Silas's gaze. "We've had a report about a runaway, a piece of property belonging to Mr. Kemp here." Elias smiled, a thin, predatory curl of his lips. "I believe you have something of mine," he said, his voice soft as silk but sharp as a razor. "A girl. I've come to collect her." Silas stood his ground, his body blocking the doorway. His knuckles were white where he gripped the frame. "There's no runaway here," he said, his voice a low growl. Elias's smile widened. He let his eyes drift past Silas, peering into the dim cabin. "Oh, I think there is. I can smell the fear from here. It's a particular scent she has, like a frightened little rabbit." He took a step forward. "Now you can either step aside and let me take what's mine, or Sheriff Cobb here can arrest you for theft. Your choice." Silas's mind was racing. He was one man. They were two, and one of them was the law. If he fought them, they'd kill him and take Clara anyway. If he surrendered, God only knew what Elias would do to her. He needed to buy time. He needed to find whatever that key unlocked. "You have a warrant?" Silas asked, stalling. Sheriff Cobb shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Silas, let's not make this difficult." "I don't need a warrant," Elias interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "My father owns this entire valley, including the law. Now move." He reached for the pistol at his hip, but just as his fingers touched the handle, another voice cut through the tension. A new voice. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, son." All three men turned. Standing by the corner of the barn was a man Silas had never seen before. He was tall and thin, dressed in the simple, dusty black clothes of a traveling preacher. He held a Bible in one hand. But his eyes were not the eyes of a preacher. They were cold, hard, and calculating. "And who in the hell are you?" Elias snarled. The preacher smiled a gentle, unnerving smile. "Just a concerned citizen," he said, taking a slow step forward. "Happened to be passing by and heard raised voices. Seems to me this rancher is on his own property, and you two are trespassing." Elias laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "An old crow quoting scripture isn't going to stop me. Get out of here before you get hurt." The preacher's smile never wavered. "Oh, I'm not quoting scripture," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'm enforcing it. Specifically the part about thou shalt not steal." He opened his coat. Pinned to the inside was not a cross, but a gleaming silver star. "U.S. Marshal, And you, Mr. Kemp, are under arrest for kidnapping." The world seemed to grind to a halt. Sheriff Cobb's face went from red to a pasty white. Elias was frozen, his hand hovering over his gun, his arrogant smirk replaced by a look of pure shock. The preacher, the marshal, hadn't come alone. Two more men armed with repeating rifles stepped out from behind the barn, their weapons leveled directly at Elias and the sheriff. It was an ambush. The poker game hadn't just gone wrong. It had been intercepted. The network Marin was a part of. It was bigger and more powerful than Silas could have ever imagined. This wasn't just about saving women. This was about bringing down men like Kemp. "You've been a thorn in the side of the territorial government for a long time, Kemp," the marshal said, his voice now ringing with authority. "We've been building a case. Human trafficking, extortion, murder." He paused, his eyes locking with Silas's. "We believe you murdered a woman named Marin Boone 5 years ago because she was getting too close to exposing you." Silas felt the ground tilt beneath his feet. Marin, murdered. The official report had said a riding accident, a tragic fall, but he'd always had a sliver of doubt. She was too good a rider. It never made sense. Now standing on his porch, it all made a terrible, gut-wrenching kind of sense. Elias, seeing his world crumbling around him, finally snapped. He wasn't going to be taken. With a wild scream of rage, he drew his pistol, but he was too slow. The marshal was faster. A single deafening shot cracked through the morning air. Elias Kemp crumpled to the porch, clutching a blossoming red stain on his shoulder, his pistol clattering on the wooden planks. Sheriff Cobb threw his hands in the air, babbling, "I didn't know. I was just following orders." The deputies moved in, cuffing the whimpering sheriff and the wounded, cursing Elias. It was over in a matter of seconds. The marshal walked over to Silas, his hard eyes softening with something that looked like sympathy. "I'm sorry you had to find out about your wife this way, Mr. Boone," he said. "She was a brave woman, one of our best informants. Her death was what started this whole investigation." He then explained everything. The network wasn't just a charity. It was an intelligence-gathering operation feeding information to the federal marshals. Clara's mother, knowing the Kemps were getting suspicious, had activated the escape plan. The poker game was supposed to deliver Clara to a female operative in Cheyenne. When Silas, an unknown civilian, won the pot, the network panicked. They thought the plan was compromised. The marshal and his team had been racing to find him and the girl before the Kemps did. "Your wife talked about you in her letters," the marshal continued, his voice quiet. "She said if anything ever happened to her, and if someone needed a safe place, this ranch was it. She said you were a good man, Silas. A quiet man, but a strong one. She trusted you." From inside the house, the door to Clara's room creaked open. She stood there, her face pale, having heard everything. She looked from the captured men to the marshal, and then to Silas. Her eyes were no longer filled with fear. They were filled with a dawning, fragile hope. He had won her in a poker game, but he hadn't bought a victim. He had inherited a legacy, Marin's legacy, a legacy of fighting back. And now he finally knew what the key was for. It wasn't for a box or a chest. Marin had been cleverer than that. "The hearth," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper. He walked back inside, Clara following close behind. He knelt before the massive stone fireplace that was the heart of the home. He ran his hands along the stones, feeling for a loose one. His fingers found it. A slight give, a subtle shift that you would never notice unless you were looking for it. He used the tip of his knife to pry it open. The stone came free, revealing a dark, hollow space within the chimney. Inside was a metal lockbox. The key Moraine had sewn into the shawl slid into the lock with a satisfying click. Silas turned it. He lifted the lid. The box was filled with papers. But it wasn't just Marin's journals. It was a ledger, a thick, detailed account book. And it wasn't Marin's handwriting. It was meticulous, spidery script, filled with dates, names, and sums of money. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's Walter Kemp's ledger," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw it in his office once. I didn't know what it was." This was the proof, the hard evidence the marshals needed. It wasn't just informant testimony anymore. It was Walter Kemp's entire criminal enterprise, laid out in his own hand. Names of girls bought and sold, bribes paid to officials like Sheriff Cobb, payouts for hired thugs, and on the last page, a single entry dated the day after Marin died. Problem on the Boone Ranch. Solved. This was the weapon Moraine had died to protect. And Clara, without even knowing it, had been the key to delivering it. Her mother hadn't just sent her to safety. She had sent her on a mission to finish what Maureen Boone had started. The marshal took the ledger with a grim reverence. "This is it," he said. "This will put Walter Kemp away for the rest of his life." He looked at Silas and Clara, standing together in the quiet cabin. "You're both free now. The Kemps can't hurt you anymore." But as the marshals rode away with their prisoners, a new kind of silence settled over the ranch. It wasn't the silence of grief or fear anymore. It was the silence of an uncertain dawn. They were safe from the Kemps, yes. But what came next? They were two strangers, thrown together by a secret war they hadn't known they were fighting. A man who thought he'd lost everything, and a girl who'd never had anything to begin with. They stood in the middle of the room, the empty lockbox between them, the ghosts of the past swirling in the air. Clara clutched the porcelain angel she always carried, a small chipped trinket her grandmother had given her. It was the only thing she truly owned. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small. Silas looked at her, at the unborn child she carried, a child who was now free from the shadow of the Kemp name. He thought of his empty house, his empty life. He thought of Marin's last wish, her faith in him. "Now," he said, his voice finding a strength he hadn't felt in years, "we begin." But beginning again is never that simple, is it? The outside threat was gone, but the inside wounds remained. How do two broken souls, haunted by ghosts and betrayal, build a future from the ashes of the past? They had won the battle, but the war for their own hearts had just begun. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of the ranch slowly returned. But it was a different rhythm. It was punctuated by the shared knowledge of the secrets that lay buried under their feet. The news of Walter Kemp's arrest spread like wildfire, a shocking tale that shook the territory to its core. People spoke in hushed tones about the quiet rancher, Silas Boone, who had somehow brought down the most powerful man in the state. They called him a hero, but Silas didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had been woken from a long, painful sleep. Clara began to change too. The constant, hunted look in her eyes started to fade. She still moved quietly, but there was a new purpose in her step. She started a small garden in the spot where Marine used to grow her herbs, tending to the soil with a gentle determination. It was as if by planting seeds in the earth, she was planting new roots for herself. But there was still a gulf between them, a chasm of unspoken things. Silas had saved her, and she was grateful. He had given her a home, and she was thankful. But they were still two people living in the shadow of his dead wife. Every room held a memory of Marin. Her rocking chair was still by the fire. Her portrait still hung on the wall. Clara knew she was a guest in another woman's life, and Silas, for his part, didn't know how to bridge that gap. He didn't know if he even wanted to. To move on felt like a betrayal of the woman he had loved, the woman who had been murdered for her bravery. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, the tension finally broke. Clara was on the porch, watching the clouds roll in, one hand resting on her now prominent belly. The baby was due soon. "She must have been very brave," Clara said softly, not looking at him. Silas, who had been chopping wood nearby, stopped, his axe resting on the block. He knew who she meant. "She was," he said. "Were you happy?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, simple and profound. It was a question no one had dared to ask him in 5 years. "Yes," he finally answered, the word feeling strange on his tongue. "We were." Clara nodded, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It's not right for me to be here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "In her house. In her life." Before Silas could respond, the first crack of lightning split the sky, followed by an immediate deafening roar of thunder. The wind whipped around the cabin, and the rain began to fall in thick, heavy sheets. And at that exact moment, Clara cried out, doubling over, her hands clutching her stomach. The baby was coming. The storm raged outside as a different kind of storm raged within the small cabin. There was no time to get a doctor. It was just Silas and Clara, facing the raw, primal forces of life and death. Silas, who had delivered countless calves and foals, found himself terrified and utterly unprepared. He worked on instinct, boiling water, gathering clean cloths, remembering things he'd heard women whisper over the years. Clara's pain came in relentless waves, and in between them, her fear was a palpable thing. "I can't," she would cry, her hands gripping his with surprising strength. "I'm not ready. I don't know how." "Yes, you can," Silas found himself saying, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "You are stronger than anyone I have ever known, Clara. You survived Elias Kemp. You survived everything. You can do this." He wasn't just saying words, he believed them. In that small lamp-lit room, with the storm howling outside, he saw her not as a victim, not as a girl he had won, but as a warrior. And then, with one final piercing cry that seemed to join with the thunder, the baby entered the world, a boy, small, red-faced and screaming with a healthy fury. The sound of his cry cut through the noise of the storm, silencing it. In the sudden, peaceful quiet, Silas wrapped the child in a clean blanket and placed him in Clara's trembling arms. She looked down at her son, and her face, which had been contorted in pain and fear, transformed. A look of pure, unadulterated awe washed over her. She laughed, a sound thick with tears. "He's real," she whispered. Silas stepped back, his own eyes wet, feeling like an intruder on a sacred moment. He had just witnessed a miracle. Not just the miracle of birth, but the miracle of a soul being reborn. Later, after Clara and the baby were resting peacefully, Silas stood on the porch. The storm had passed. The air was clean and cool, and a million stars were scattered across the black velvet sky. He felt different. The grief for Marin was still there, a dull ache in his chest. But for the first time in 5 years, it wasn't the only thing he felt. He felt hope. He thought about the child sleeping inside, a child with no name, a child who represented a new beginning. He thought about Clara, the quiet, broken girl who had shown him what true strength was. He knew then that this wasn't Marin's house anymore. It wasn't his house. It was their house, a place not for ghosts, but for the living. But just as that thought settled in his mind, he saw a flicker of light in the distance, a lantern moving slowly up the road toward his ranch, a lone rider in the dead of night. The marshals had taken the Kemps. The threat was supposed to be over. So who was coming for them now? A cold dread, sharp and familiar, snaked its way up his spine. He slipped back inside, grabbing his rifle from its place over the mantel. He moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The rider was getting closer. He could make out the shape now. A large man on a powerful horse. He wasn't riding like someone with good intentions. He was riding like a predator closing in on its prey. Silas's heart pounded in his chest. He had just brought a new life into this world. He would not let anyone threaten it. He raised the rifle, resting the barrel on the windowsill, and took aim. As the rider came into the faint circle of light from the cabin's windows, Silas's finger tightened on the trigger. And then he froze. He recognized the man. It wasn't one of Kemp's thugs. It wasn't a lawman. It was Jedediah Thorne, the man from the poker game, the man who had lost Clara to him. He was supposed to be a bit player, a reluctant actor in the network's drama. But the look on his face was not one of reluctance. It was one of pure, venomous hatred. And in his hand, he wasn't carrying a lantern. He was carrying a lit torch. "Boone!" Jedediah roared, his voice carrying on the night air. "You ruined everything. You were never part of the plan." He wasn't an actor. He wasn't part of the network. Silas had been wrong. Jedediah had been playing his own game all along. "That girl was my ticket," he screamed, his voice cracking with fury. "I was supposed to sell her to a man in the mountains, a man who pays well for specific tastes. The Kemps were just her first stop. You and your dead wife's meddling friends cost me a fortune." He spurred his horse forward, raising the torch high. His plan was brutally simple. He was going to burn the cabin to the ground, with all of them inside. Silas didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot was true. Jedediah cried out, clutching his arm, the torch falling from his grasp into a patch of wet grass, where it sputtered and died. His horse reared, panicked by the sound, and threw him to the ground. He lay there moaning, his escape cut off. Silas kept the rifle trained on him as he walked out onto the porch. "It's over, Thorne." But Jedediah just laughed, a broken, gurgling sound. "It's never over," he spat, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You think Kemp was the top of the food chain? He was nothing. A middleman. The people I work for, they don't forget. They don't forgive. They'll find her. They'll always be looking for the girl with the Kemp brand." The brand. The thorny vine on the shawl. It wasn't a family crest. It was a mark of ownership for a trafficking ring far bigger and more monstrous than the Kemps. The network hadn't been trying to save Clara from just one man. They had been trying to pull her out of a spider's web that stretched across the entire territory, and Silas had just announced their location to every spider in that web. He tied up the wounded Jedediah in the barn and waited for dawn. The joy he had felt just hours before was gone, replaced by a cold, grim reality. They hadn't won. They had just survived one battle in a war that was far from over. Clara and her newborn son were not safe. They might never be safe. When the sun rose, he rode into town and delivered Jedediah to the marshal's office, telling them everything. The marshal listened, his face growing darker with every word. "This is bad, Silas," he admitted. "This syndicate Jedediah is talking about, we've heard rumors. They're like ghosts, untouchable. If they've marked that girl, they won't stop." "So what do we do?" Silas asked. The marshal looked at him, his eyes filled with a heavy sadness. "You run," he said. "Take the girl and the baby and disappear. Change your names. Go somewhere no one knows you. It's the only way." Silas rode back to the ranch with the marshal's words echoing in his head. Run. Leave his home, his land, the only place he'd ever known. Leave Marin's grave behind. It felt like an impossible choice. When he got back, he found Clara sitting on the porch, rocking her son, who she had decided to name Samuel. She looked up at him, and she knew. She saw the despair in his eyes. "We have to leave, don't we?" she asked. "It's the only way you'll be safe," he said, his voice heavy. She looked down at the tiny baby in her arms, then out at the vast open prairie that stretched to the horizon. She had been running her whole life. She was tired of running. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is our home now. Maureen died to protect this place, to make it a sanctuary. We can't honor her memory by abandoning it." "Clara, they will come for you," Silas insisted. "They are dangerous men." "You are a dangerous man too," she said, meeting his gaze. There was no fear in her eyes, only a fierce, unwavering resolve. "You stood up to Elias Kemp. You faced down Jedediah Thorne. We will face this together. We don't run. We fight." Silas looked at her, this young woman who had walked into his life carrying nothing but sorrow and secrets. She had shown him how to live again, how to feel again. She was right. Running wasn't the answer. Marin didn't run, and neither would he. A decision settled in his heart, as solid and immovable as the mountains on the horizon. "All right," he said. "We don't run. We make our stand. We turn this ranch into a fortress. Let them come." But as they fortified the ranch, building higher fences, barring the windows at night, a new, more insidious enemy crept in. It wasn't a syndicate of criminals. It was the town. The people who had once hailed Silas as a hero now looked at him with suspicion and fear. They saw him as a magnet for trouble. They saw Clara not as a survivor, but as a tainted woman, a source of danger. They whispered about her in the general store. They turned their backs when she and Silas came to town for supplies. The whispers grew uglier. She was a harlot. The baby was a bastard. Silas was a fool for keeping them. The isolation was a prison of its own. They had a home, but they were exiles in their own land. The weight of it all began to crush Silas. He had promised Clara they would fight, but how could they fight whispers? How could they fight hatred? He grew quiet again. the old grief and despair threatening to swallow him whole. He saw the toll it was taking on Clara, too. The light that had returned to her eyes was dimming again. She spent her days caring for Samuel, her movements efficient but joyless. They were two people in a fortress, slowly starving from a lack of hope. One night, he couldn't take it anymore. He found her in the barn staring at the empty stall where Marin's horse used to be. "Maybe the marshal was right," he said, his voice rough. "Maybe we should have run." Clara turned to him, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. "Running wouldn't have changed who I am, Silas," she said. "It wouldn't have changed what was done to me. The shame follows you." "It wasn't your fault," he said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. "I know," she whispered, "but they don't. And sometimes I think you don't either. I think you look at me and Samuel, and you see the trouble we brought you, the end of your quiet life." He wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. A part of him, a dark, selfish part, did resent it. He resented the fear, the isolation, the constant looking over his shoulder. He resented that his quiet grief had been replaced by this loud, dangerous chaos. And in that moment of terrible, honest silence, the barn door creaked open. They both spun around, their hearts leaping into their throats. Standing in the doorway was an old woman. It was Elspeth, the town midwife, a woman known for her sharp tongue and her even sharper eyes. No one had spoken to them in weeks. "Heard you two were acting like fools, so I came to see for myself," she said, her voice like gravel. She walked into the barn, her eyes scanning the reinforced doors, the barred windows. "Hiding from the world, letting whispers kill you faster than any bullet could." She stopped in front of them, her gaze softening as she looked at Clara. "I knew your wife, Silas," she said. "Marin was no saint. She was a fighter. She knew this town was full of cowards and hypocrites, but she never let them silence her. She fought for people. She built things. She didn't hide." Elspeth then turned her piercing gaze on Clara. "And you think you're the only girl to ever walk through hell? This whole damn territory was built by women who survived worse. The shame isn't yours to carry. It's theirs. The ones who whisper, the ones who look away. Let them choke on it." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden bird. She pressed it into Clara's hand. "Marin gave me one of these years ago. A signal, a promise. She said if I ever saw someone who needed a sanctuary, I should send them here. She said this ranch wasn't just a piece of land, it was an idea." Elspeth looked back and forth between their stunned faces. "So, are you going to let that idea die? Or are you going to finish what she started?" With that, she turned and left as abruptly as she had arrived. Her words hung in the air, a challenge and a revelation. Marin hadn't just been saving women. She had been building a community, a network of the forgotten and the outcast. And they had let fear isolate them from the very people who could have been their allies. Silas looked at Clara, and for the first time, he didn't see the trouble she had brought. He saw the strength she possessed. He saw the future she carried in her arms. He walked over to her and gently took her hand. "She's right," he said. "We've been fighting the wrong battle." He led her back to the house and went to the portrait of Marin that hung on the wall. He took it down carefully. Behind it, there was a small, hidden compartment. Silas hadn't known it was there. Inside was another journal. This one wasn't filled with coded messages. It was a letter. A long letter from Marin to him. It was dated the day before she died. "My dearest Silas," it began. "If you are reading this, it means the worst has happened. It means the Kemps found out about my work. I have no regrets except for the pain this will cause you. I need you to know that the work is not finished. I have built a network, a chain of safe houses. But it needs an anchor. It needs a home. This ranch, Silas, it has to be the anchor. You don't have to do it alone. Look for the helpers, the midwife, the preacher, the blacksmith's wife. Look for the people who carry the bird. They are my family. Let them be yours. I have always loved you, Silas, not for your strength, but for your goodness. Don't let the darkness of this world put out your light. Be the sanctuary. Yours forever, Marin." Tears streamed down Silas's face as he read the letter aloud. He had been so lost in his own grief, he had never truly seen his wife. He had never understood the scope of her courage. He and Clara weren't alone. They had never been alone. They just needed to open the door. The next Sunday, they did something they hadn't done in months. They hitched the wagon, dressed in their best clothes, and with Samuel bundled between them, they drove into town. Not to the general store, but to the church. As they walked up the steps, the whispers started immediately. The stairs were like daggers. People shifted away from them in the pews. The preacher, a timid man who was afraid of his own shadow, began his sermon with his eyes fixed firmly on the back wall. But then, halfway through the service, Clara stood up. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was clear and strong. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice echoing in the silent church. "I was a victim of Elias Kemp. I am a survivor, and I am not ashamed." Then she held up the small wooden bird Elspeth had given her. A gasp went through the congregation. For a moment there was nothing, just a heavy, stunned silence. Then an old woman in the back row, the blacksmith's wife, slowly stood up. She reached into her purse and held up a matching wooden bird. Then another person stood, and another, the quiet rancher who lived down the valley. The woman who ran the boarding house. Person after person rose to their feet, each one holding up the simple, powerful symbol. The church was filled with them, Marin's army, an army of the quiet, the overlooked, the helpers. They had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, waiting for a signal. The whispers died. The stares of judgment were replaced by looks of awe and respect. The timid preacher fell silent, his sermon forgotten. Silas stood up and put his arm around Clara, his heart swelling with a fierce protective pride. They were not outcasts. They were a part of something bigger than themselves. They had found their army, and they were finally ready to fight. The syndicate, the faceless men Jedediah Thorne had warned them about, they would still be out there. The danger wasn't gone, but now they had a shield. They had a community. That afternoon, back at the ranch, a steady stream of visitors came up the long dirt road. The blacksmith's wife with a freshly baked pie, the midwife with herbs for the baby, the quiet rancher with two of his strongest sons, offering to stand watch. They came with food, with supplies, with stories of their own. They came to welcome the new anchors of the network. As evening fell, Silas and Clara stood on the porch, watching the last of their new family depart. Samuel was sleeping soundly in his cradle. The porch swing, which had been still for 5 long years, was gently moving in the evening breeze. Clara reached out and took Silas's hand. "We did it," she whispered. "No," Silas said, turning to her, his eyes full of a love he never thought he would feel again. "You did it. You reminded us what we were fighting for." He leaned in, and for the first time he kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion or desperation. It was a kiss of peace, a kiss of homecoming, a promise that two broken souls could not only heal, but could build something new and stronger in the broken places. Out on that quiet patch of prairie, beneath a sky full of stars, something beautiful and fierce had taken root. They were no longer defined by the violence of their past, but by the community they were building for the future. They were a sanctuary, a beacon of hope in a dark world. The quietest miracles they learned were not the ones that saved you from the storm, but the ones that taught you how to stand together in the rain. They knew the fight wasn't over. The shadows were long, and the world was full of men like Kemp and Thorne. But they would face whatever came next, not as victims, not as outcasts, but as a family. And they would never, ever be alone again. What do you think? Can a community truly be a shield against evil? Can love truly bloom from the ashes of trauma? The story of Silas and Clara shows us that the greatest strength isn't found in a single hero, but in the quiet courage of many hearts beating as one. It reminds us that no one should have to carry their shame alone. If their journey from strangers to saviors touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. We have so many more stories to share about the quiet heroes who tame the wild, not just in the land, but in the human soul.